Welcome to the Lines Between Us Live. I'm Nicole Alifanti, the president and one of the founders of CURE, the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. I'm honored to be moderating this panel tonight with Chief Sandra DeRuza of the Village of Mamaroneck Police Department, Bertha Rodriguez, who is an attorney and a consultant for the Community Resource Center, and Jeff King, longtime resident of Mamaroneck and the Town of Mamaroneck councilman. The Lines Between Us is a partnership between LMC Media, the Community Resource Center, and CURE. We really felt strongly about continuing to hear the stories of our neighbors who experience racism on a daily basis. And I say continuing because for the past few years, we have had a lot of folks come out and speak. What's different about these videos is they're animated. They give the person who had the experience some anonymity, so they are anonymous. I'd like to get to our panelists. Please introduce yourselves and tell us kind of what your historical connection is to Mamaroneck.
Okay, so I guess I'll go first. I'm Chief Sandra DeRuza from the Village of Mamaroneck Police Department. I have been born and raised in Mamaroneck, first generation here. I've been with the Village of Mamaroneck Police Department. I will be completing my 17th year this week. And I became provisional chief in December of 2020. So I have just over a year under my belt.
Thank you.
And hi, I'm Bertha Rodriguez. I'm an attorney consultant with the Community Resource Center. The Community Resource Center has been a nonprofit organization in Mamaroneck for 24 years. And I serve as attorney for immigration matters for people that are in deportation proceedings and people that are seeking immigration status. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff King, a longtime resident of the town of Mamaroneck. I frequently tell people that I actually live in the house that I grew up in. We've been a resident of the town of Mamaroneck for about 50 years now. And having grown up in the town of Mamaroneck, I racial divide. I've seen implicit bias, and I have worked in my later years, for the last 5 years, as a town council to try to start a dialogue and have a conversation. So bring our community together.
Thank you so much. And I hope that's what this conversation is, just a seed, a beginning of something. So the series is several videos, I think maybe 8 or 9. They're on LMC Media's YouTube page. And tonight we're going to focus on one. We're going to watch it together. It's about 5 minutes. It's called The Train Story. And it's about a DACA student who has a confrontation with police on a train on his way to work. And this takes place in the Bronx. So we're not looking at the Mamaroneck Police Department, but we are lucky enough to have the insights of Chief DeRuza around this. Basically, we're going to watch this together for 5 minutes, and then we'll start a conversation about what we saw, thoughts around it, and we'll dig in a little bit to what's going on here in Mamaroneck as well in terms of reimagining police and community relationships. So if you want to roll the video.
I was bullied on a routine basis for being different.
To let everyone in the room know that I was Hispanic and I was proud.
It soon grew to the point where the small comments started becoming a much bigger deal.
At the time, DACA just came out and I knew that I could not really take any risks with law enforcement.
The kid had called her a dumb Mexican and to go back to her country. Can I hide away, but we are in the silence.
I recently took a summer job in the Bronx, and since I did not have a car or knew how to drive yet, I had to take the public transportation every day. On this particular day, there was a Caucasian lady who was walking in front of me and had the same idea of going through the cars. When we crossed over to the next car, I saw an overweight man from the outside the entrance. He flashed his necklace to the lady and said something I did not hear. The lady followed him to outside. I kept walking until the same guy stopped me, showed me his badge necklace, and he said that I am with the NYPD. He then told me to follow him, which I obliged. He made me sit on the bench outside, and I saw that the lady was seated, but on the other side. She was visibly upset, waving her hands all over the place and complaining to them about something. I wasn't really paying much attention to. The other cop, who I assume was his partner, he wrote a ticket and let the lady go without any further incident. The large man began to approach me. He told me that I cannot cross the intersection between the cars, etc. Standard stuff before getting a ticket. What threw me off was the fact that after mentioning this, he asked me, "Have you ever been arrested before?" Having never experienced something like this, I honestly thought it was a joke. So I laughed and I said no. He then went over to his partner and they started talking. While looking at me for a second, the same guy came back and asked me the same question. "Have you ever been arrested before?" By then, I could kind of tell that he was not joking, so I gave a stern no. I began to get a little bit worried now, since back then, at the time, DACA just came out and I knew that I could not really take any risks with law enforcement. This was becoming a nightmare scenario pretty quickly. The cop asked me to show him my ID. I gave him my college ID, which had my picture and name on it. When he showed it to his partner, he grabbed it and I heard him say my name and start communicating back and forth through the walkie-talkie. The partner, who looked Puerto Rican, began asking me, "What is this?" I replied that it was my ID. He did not seem content with it because he followed up by saying that if I had a state ID, which I said, "Unfortunately, no, I don't drive. I do not have a license." He asked me if I have a social security number, to which I said yes. When he told me to give it to him, I simply said, "Why would I carry it on me? I mean, I can tell it to you if you want." As soon as I said that, I could tell the guy was annoyed because he threw his hands in the air and I just stayed quiet. I was going to be late for work because I was there for at least 20 minutes. I remember vividly him telling me, "You know we can arrest you right now, right?" He wrote me the ticket for crossing the platform in between train cars, and then he said something along the likes of me being off the hook and that he did me a favor. I did not look back and I just went about my day.
These racist and anti-immigrant stories are common. They happen right here in Mamaroneck. They happen in Westchester County, in our neighborhoods, and even in our homes. It's important for us to continue to support our neighbors and our local community members to feel safe enough to share their stories. We have to internalize them and continue to make change so that we can end the racial divide and end anti-immigrant sentiments. We welcome you to support the Community Resource Center, your local nonprofit empowering the new immigrant community in Mamaroneck and Westchester County.
So first of all, those videos, all of them were really beautifully produced. And I give a shout out to LMC for that. And so let's dig in a tiny bit to what we all just watched. Everyone's going to have a different take on it. You know, we're sort of sitting in that uncomfortable zone of bias and racism. And I think we use bias as a softer term, but I think bias is a symptom of structures of racism that we've all just sort of absorbed in our lifetimes, in different ways and spaces. So I want to just start with Chief Deruza. What, and let's make it clear to those who are joining now, this wasn't Mamaroneck Police, so we're just getting insight from a police chief on something like this. But when you watch that video, I mean, I always want to ask police after something goes down, what was going on? What were you thinking? So what's happening with those police in that situation, or at least what can you read from it?
Sure, and obviously we're just speculating on what was actually going on at the time. So judging by the young man's story, apparently he had some kind of infraction on the train that they were going to give him a summons for. So they asked for his ID. I'm assuming they probably needed name, date of birth, something of that nature for the summons. So in terms of, asking, has he been arrested before? I mean, that's normally not something that we would ask unless we had reason to do so. For example, were we looking for somebody who might have fit that description for a similar crime that just occurred, something like that? At no time during that interaction would they have had any reason to search any of his property or anything like that, which they didn't do. The only thing, again, being devil's advocate, to try to maybe support the police is, when they asked, have you ever been arrested before? And again, maybe because they were concerned that this person had done something prior, the way that the young man answered, and again, very honestly, like, no, I've never done anything before. Maybe the police officers took that as maybe something deceptive, like, oh, he's just trying to joke, play it off that, yes, maybe I did do something, but I don't want them to know. It's hard to tell with that. Normally, if an officer does need to check somebody's information to see if there is an active warrant out for somebody, that's when they would call in information to their dispatch or their headquarters to see, is there something that this person, if there's a warrant out for them or something like that. So it appears they did issue him a summons, as they did with the young lady, and let him go on his way. So again, it is hard to speculate at the time what was going on with them. I did notice on LMC TV's webpage that they do have a document there about Know Your Rights. I think it was from the ACLU, which is a very good document. It's very clear. And that is something, and I just noticed it today as we were preparing for tonight, that I'm going to include on the Village of Mamaroneck PD's website. We've just created one, a standalone page that we're hoping to launch next week. And as part of that website, it's going to be in both English and Spanish. So one of the tabs that we do have is about car stops and what to do if you are pulled over, how to file personnel complaints, how to, during emergencies, how to find information. So there's a bunch of information on that website. So be on the lookout for that in the next couple of weeks or so.
Thank you so much. So that's great. And I was going to ask you about what that person's rights are, but I think maybe, because we have tons of questions, maybe Bertha, if you want to speak to what in that situation, if a client came to you and said, I'm freaked out, I was stopped on the train, it was so scary, I went through this thing, they asked me these questions, like what actually could that young man have said? Could he have said, no, I can't, I'm not showing you my, what is appropriate?
So one of the things that the clients that we serve, a majority of them are undocumented. And in this case, this young man is a DACA recipient. And DACA it's not a permanent status, it's a temporary status, which has to be renewed every 2 years. So having an interaction with police, the biggest fear is then being, turned over to ICE. And, it's, in his DACA depends on having a perfect record. Even having a small infraction sometimes could get his DACA renewal, it could get rescinded, and he can end up even in proceedings, and in the worst case scenario, he could end up deported. And at the very least, just if he has an infraction and it's a unlawful denial, he would have to spend so much money just to get his case appealed and to be able to get back to where it is. So when someone comes to me with this, with something like this, their fear is, am I going to get deported? Somebody in his shoes. In regards to the Know Your Rights, like the chief mentioned, we have in the community, we have Know Your Rights where we speak about what to do when you're interacting with police. And one of the main things is, remain silent. And, if you are arrested, ask for an attorney, do not continue speaking. And one of the things they don't have to answer about their citizenship status, which was one of the, do you have a social security? It's not something that really has to do with what, the cop may have been searching for someone that fit his description. That could be something that he can get from his ID and then go back and check if it's someone that has, some sort of, foreign or anything. So definitely one of the things that we talk about is making sure that the people we serve that have IDs, either Westchester County IDs, and now because of the green light, they're able to get state IDs, driver's license, etc., so that they're not walking around with, let's say, their passport or anything that would be able to demonstrate that they're not U.S. citizens. And specifically for him, it's that fear. I just got DACA. It's not a permanent status. I could end up deported. And so just kind of having that conversation surrounding what his rights are.
Right. And I think, Durandi says something in the closing of that video. She talks about internalizing this. And I think that's a big thing that across the board, we're all somehow internalizing narratives and bias. And I want to be sensitive to what police internalize on a daily basis, what folks of color internalize on a daily basis. I think we can't negate that from the conversation that, and that kind of brings me to Jeff, like you grew up here, you had a great experience here, you stayed here. But I've heard you tell a story about being a young kid and receiving some bias from the police. And, there's internalization there, right? So unpack that a little bit for us and tell us about your experience.
Well, if I may, I'd like to quickly go back to the film strip, which you just watched, because I think it's all in the same. I think this film strip speaks on so many different levels. I think it speaks of what we're discussing here, implicit bias, but it also speaks of the fear that people of color feel when they're encountered by a police officer. Or I say that because historically, people of color have by the numbers, have been incarcerated much more than whites. So when you watch this video and the young student is saying, well, there's a white woman who for the same infraction speaks to the police, she shows her frustration, expresses her frustration, and she's told you can leave. Whereas this individual, the conversation is one of intimidation, which I have personally experienced. And it's from the get-go, from the initial steps, the initial conversation, it's one of intimidation. It's not one of respect. It's not one of trust. He's not given an opportunity to speak with impunity. He's not given a chance to actually speak his mind because he's fearful of the ramifications, being a DACA person or having that DACA classification. So I think there's so many different levels that when you see a film strip like this, yes, this occurs every day. And the experiences for someone of color and someone of a white person, they're two totally different experiences. And we see the police officer, and I think that's a very important part, a very important focus, is that you have two police officers. And the second police officer is Hispanic. And that just reinforces that we all inherently have our own biases. And just because you come across another officer who is of color, that doesn't negate the fact that they have their own biases. Growing up, as I did as a young teen, moving here, my family and I, all of my friends, for the most part, were white. And me being the lone Black person. And it was a difficult transition. And I don't think you ever get over that transition. I think it's a constant learning curve of which I go back to. And I think my children go back to. But specifically, being singled out by white police officers when I'm simply riding my bicycle with my friends. And again, it's that confrontation. It's that fear that, oh my God, what have I done? Why am I being singled out? Exactly as in this film strip, well, have you stolen this bicycle? Where do you live? Because the implicit bias, the implication is that you're a person of color and how you can't possibly live in Larchmont, in the town of Mamaroneck. And this was a reoccurring occurrence, both in the town of Mamaroneck and the village of Larchmont. And it came to an abrupt stop, fortunately, because my father was a lawyer and threatened to sue both the village of Mamaroneck and the town of Larchmont if they didn't stop pulling me over. So so as a young teenager, I learned firsthand the ramifications of implicit bias.
Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, I think, it's interesting because that the narrative of I don't stop to think of what a police officer is thinking. Like you said, there could have been a a note out of an APV or whatever that's called, excuse my terminology, you know, saying there's a 5'7" Hispanic man who just ran from a store or whatever. And that's the narrative that they have in their head. And I think like what we're getting at here is, and we're talking about reimagining. And I know Chief Jaruza, you've been really transparent about some of the things you're bringing to the police department for these for and so I think we're all longing, and I don't want to impose this on anyone. I am, you know, for those transactions to be different. And so the cops might know they're looking for a kid that looks like that kid, but that kid doesn't know that. So what, you know, where are we headed to? Are police looking internally at themselves and saying, what other transactions could transpire where we're keeping people safe because we have somebody that we need to get, you know, because they just did something. But at the same time, we're not going to just sort of like, you know, traumatize someone in a moment where they were just trying to get to work, right? So I think we're trying to meet in this middle area. And what are the conversations right now in your department and with the things you're bringing in that are sort of pointing to different ways of policing potentially? And I could be projecting that, but I'd love to hear you.
Sure. So as you're aware, then Governor Cuomo had put out a mandate for police reform. So even prior to police reform, the Village of Mamaroneck Police Department was working on several programs to combat these types of things. So the first thing was a procedural justice training. So it's actually a 3-module training that's usually given at least 6 months separated from each other. So far the department has completed 2 modules of that procedural justice, the third being implicit bias, which we're going to be completing this year. And as part of the procedural justice, it focuses on 4 pillars, so to speak. So it's about giving everyone a voice, okay? Being transparent, remaining neutral, and having respect. So if someone is approached, the officers are trained to explain to the person why they're being stopped, why they're being approached, let them voice their feelings about what's going on, remaining neutral through the encounter. And that's building that trust, building that transparency. COVID put a little bit of a damper on our in-person meetings. We've had meetings in the past with the Community Resource Center, trying to engage, asking questions, having open forums. So we will be looking to continue those discussions in the future once things kind of open up. We've also given the officers business cards where if they do have an interaction with someone, they have their name on them. It has the phone number for the police department there to give those to people that they interact with. Also, I don't want to jump ahead a little bit, but we've talked about, I know we had, I had asked both CURE and the CRC to provide a letter of support for us to attend or else to give our officers the ABLE training, which is active bystandership for law enforcement. So basically what the premise of that is if they see an officer, regardless of rank, doing something inappropriate, using excessive use of force, giving them the tools to be able to stop what's going on. They equate it in the training to almost the same thing. It doesn't have to just be law enforcement. It could be a doctor and a nurse in an operating room where the nurse sees the doctor doing something incorrect. Is the nurse going to speak out? Or a pilot and a co-pilot, is the co-pilot going to feel comfortable speaking out to the pilot? So it's in that same level that they're talking about in terms of making sure they understand that they need to do this, they need to act out. And for the person who is being what we're going to call abled, they know it's not something that they're being penalized for. It's basically, I don't want to say saving them, but in a way it is, so that they understand they're not taking it to the next level. They need to have a timeout and this other officer takes charge.
Yep, that makes sense. It's great. I mean, I think the fact that, you know, this was also being thought of before the mandate. I think, you know, some people, both you, Jeff, too, had the Racial Equity Task Force prior to Cuomo's mandate. And I think that says a lot. I think that, you know, people, when the mandate came around, were thinking this is optics. What are happening to these reports? What does it matter? Where are they going? You know, but the fact that our communities were thinking about this, I think is important. I just want to, we have a lot of other questions. I just want to get to Berta really quickly. What, you know, when you have someone come to you who's been through something like that, what are some of the things that you think community members want in police relations? You know, have your clients voiced to you, like, if only it went down this way, or I wish I could this, or I wish, you know, police officers were on the streets more talking to us, or what are there some general like wants and wishes from communities that you deal with?
Well, one of the concerns that we're having with police relations in the community that we serve has been the language barrier. So the majority of our clients are Spanish speaking. Some of them are from native, like Indian communities that speak a different dialect that are not even Spanish. So having, you know, so they might have a handle a little bit of in Spanish, but they're not even getting just, you know, even serviced in Spanish. So so that's one of the biggest problems. And you know, they want to be able to report crimes and feel safe in the community, and not be afraid. You know, the biggest fear is having an interaction with ICE. And you know, some of our clients have expressed that they're afraid to go through certain streets because they're afraid that they're going to have an interaction that could end up, like I said before, in deportation. And it's happened, you know, to a client where, you know, got pulled over for a license, not having a driver's license, and ended up getting deported. You know, and it wasn't something that was an enforcement priority. The person did not have a record. You know, it was just simply something that was an infraction that you get a ticket, you go to court, and that's it. You know, so I think the biggest fear is just that, not understanding that there is that, you know, the police not necessarily working with ICE, but it's sort of like gets blurred because of what's happened in some of the past in the community. So, you know, but we have the Know Your Rights to kind of talk about that. And we have been in communication with the chief of police and just kind of addressing some of these things. So I was very happy to hear also about the fact that there will be a Spanish posted on the website. And these are some sort of the things that I think will bring about more interaction with the community and just trusting more in the police department.
Thank you. So Jeff,
Nicole, just to say, Bertha said something. So like she was saying, we do have some Spanish speaking officers. However, their dialects and things are different. So we do have access to what's called a language line that we're able to have. It through an operator. It would be a third party that we could call at the time of whatever's going on and have that interaction to get a full idea about, you know, the interaction or the crime that was committed, things like that. Second part is, if an officer interacts with somebody, you know, on the street, we're not asking for immigration status. That would only happen at the time if they were arrested for a misdemeanor or a felony offense where they had to get fingerprinted. Other than that, you know, we don't ask for that. And we have had some concerns about members of the community coming forward to report crimes. And that's something that obviously we don't want to see happen. And we know that we want to work on that. Hence the reason of us wanting to have more forums to engage with more members of the community, to have them feel safe. Because obviously we don't want anyone to be the victim of crime. So anything we could help facilitate that, we want to do that.
That's great. And I'm going to want all of these resources that you're discussing so we can share them out after this and keep people, you know, just abreast of what's going on. Jeff, I wanted to just circle back with you for the town of Mamaroneck's report and how that came about, and just tell us a little bit about how you sort of started a task force prior to the mandate and what came of that. What was that process like, and what are some of the things that are happening in the town of Mamaroneck?
The process came about watching the events unfold about George Floyd and his death, the murder of George Floyd, and it struck a chord with me that something has to be done, that we have to start the dialogue between communities, people of color, people of white, but with the police force, police departments throughout the country. And so I took it upon myself to speak to our town supervisor and to put out the idea of forming a racial equity task force so we could begin the dialogue. And let me just say that, you know, when we're talking about police departments, it's not particularly, you know, the town of Mamaroneck or the village of Mamaroneck or the village of Larchmont. It's the institution of the police department or institutions of the departments of how they started in this country. You know, they started in, and I think that has progressed to where we are now, and that is part of the problem. And I think that, and I believe that training has not gone into the academies as to, for police departments to realize that the first, you take an oath to become actually a guardian and not a warrior. And and we can get into that later, but I say that because the police departments started in the 1700s as slave patrols to monitor the movement and the capture of runaway slaves. And yes, you might have had the first police department in Boston and the second one in New York City, but after the Civil War, these slave patrols, well, what happened to them? They became police departments. So you have this ingrained institution of policing that was brought about to protect the status quo, i.e. white people and money. And I think philosophically, you have to look at that. You have to break that down. And that is what we try to do with the Racial Equity Task Force in starting the conversation and looking at the totality of policing in the 21st century. Barack Obama, back in 2015, commissioned a committee, police reform in the 21st century. 5 years later, George Floyd is killed. And now 2 years later, we are having a conversation about police reform in the 21st century. Well, in 1965, you had Watts, you had LA burning. So where have we progressed over the years? And I don't think anything is going to happen until we have conversations like we're having tonight. Fruitful conversations where we can have that dialogue. And that is what the Racial Equity Task Force, the whole idea behind the Racial Equity Task Force, to start and have the uncomfortable conversations, to find out where we came from so we can give ourselves some kind of direction as a community, how we're going to go forward. Subsequent to that, as the chief just said, Governor Cuomo, former Governor Cuomo, came out with Executive Order 203 to address and look at and review and come up with policies in your own communities for policing in the 21st century. I believe that our committee put together a cohesive report on some of the tenets of procedural justice, on training, on talking about the interaction, talking about the community involvement. Surveys were presented to the community, and we had an overwhelming response. And our community demographics, as we know, differ from Mamaroneck, but we had an overwhelming percentage in favor of, or they think the police department is doing a great job. And we do have a good police department. Of the 15% or almost 16% of people of color who responded to the survey, almost more than half of them responded that they have encountered, they have witnessed episodes of police, what they feel is police discrimination. So clearly, there is a need for this dialogue. There is a need to review our maybe outdated practices and policies, and that is what the report tried to address. You know, where can we improve on what we have? Where can we suggest new policies? How can we discuss or bring to the conversation de-escalation? So these are all the tenets of what went into our police report.
That's great. You said a lot there.
I'm sorry.
No. I'm not criticizing. It's incredible. And these are the things that, you know, I find I find this to be a really a discussion that needs to go on and on and on, because we're not going to nail all this down in an hour. But I do want to go to Chief Jaruza on that. I mean, there's so much talk about every institution, right, connected to American history that sort of filters into how we live today. And I find it freeing to discuss it as institutional, because it's really, you know, police officers usually want to be police officers because they want to protect people, and they'll run into a burning building, right? Like, they're often heroes. And at the same time, there is a history connected to that. And there is deep bias. And there is this sense of kind of patrolling the Black and brown body. And that's stuff that we're all sort of looking at. Well, not all of us, but many of us are starting to look at. We're starting to put ourselves in these uncomfortable spaces and think about it. And I'm curious, like, what is the culture? I know, you know, defund and all this stuff has been coming like a tsunami at police officers, but what's going on internally? So many pedestrians don't get a look at that. What is the feeling? Is it like, whoa, wait a second, we do have some stuff to work on? And is there a sense of almost hope in the police department that there is some crap we can cut through, and that's going to like actually benefit us? You know, like, what's the vibe? Like, can you speak to that? Because Jeff's just said a lot, and I know we have a script, but I also want to dig into what he said.
Yeah, sure. So like you said, I mean, most police officers, they become police officers because they want to protect and serve their community, give people a voice that don't have a voice. So are there, you know, bad officers? Yes, as there are bad doctors in every profession, right? So I think a lot of the focus too, especially even before reform, but now with reform, is about our hiring practices and making sure that, you know, people are properly vetted to make sure you are hiring good candidates. Hiring from the community, so you have proper representation on your force that represents your communities. Sometimes people that have ties to the community is helpful because they know a lot of the members of their community, and they have, you know, that interaction with them prior, so they have that bond. You know, in terms of the mandate itself, I think at first a lot of officers were apprehensive to it, not knowing what it was going to bring. I can speak for my department that we were already in compliance with a lot of things, and we already had a lot of things on the table. But it gave us a good opportunity to take a look internally and say, hey, what are we doing already? What can we do better? And what aren't we doing that we can now do? Jeffrey mentioned about de-escalation. We just finished our de-escalation training as well. So we're trying to check off a lot of things that we know are important topics, and just maybe training that was lacking before that is so important. Something else that came up was mental health. And should law enforcement be responding to calls for mental health services? The Village of Mamaroneck Police Department is one of 4 departments that are part of a pilot program called 911 Diversion, where if somebody calls needing mental health services, it will be sent over to a crisis counselor first to see if they can mediate it versus police officers responding. Of course, if there's an imminent threat, then the officers will respond. But if it's not something that's urgent matter, we're going to try to get them the social service resources first. So again, that's one of the things that came up as part of police reform. So there are definitely some benefits to that report.
Okay, thank you. Bert, did you have any thoughts on what we just discussed, or do you want to have some input?
No, I think everything was well said. I don't have anything. Okay,
I just want to make sure I'm not leaving you behind. So I want to talk a little bit about that. You know, is it a positive thing to recruit from our communities? I mean, to look at, you know, our own kids coming out of high school who want to be police officers and saying, you know, work here, right? I mean, they just went through the system. They go to the local shops, they go to the local school, they play on sports teams, and they feel connected to the community. I mean, I think that does a service. Is there data on that? Or, you know, to communities when our own people are kind of overseeing things? Is that a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you know, if there's any specific data out there, but, you know, what I can tell you is our department did, and it'll be on our website, did put together a recruitment video to try to engage members of the community to take the most recent police test. So there is some thought to people who do work for the community, do have more of a stake in the community, they feel. And I can speak to a couple instances where, because the officer was local and knew people, he was able to mitigate a very tense situation because he identified himself and said, oh, I know a family member of this person. And they made that bond, and that kind of almost in itself de-escalated the situation. And then again, it's about, picking the right people. And the most important thing is just being able to talk to people. I always, still teach a little bit at the police academy, and I tell them it's not about, you being 6'5" and, 300 pounds and having that presence. It's just, you're yourself, and just being able to talk to people is really what's most important.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So Jeff, do you have anything to add right now before we start to maybe take some questions?
No, I just want to echo what the chief just for your training and for everything you've implemented over the last several months, because I think it goes back to one of the basic principles is that a community is not going to feel safe. Residents are not going to feel safe if they see the police force as enforcers and not guardians. And clearly, one way to break down that barrier is to hire from within. If I know personally that back in the day, there was a friend of mine from high school, and who was a person of color, and he became a town of Mamaroneck police officer. And you could see him, or I would see him patrolling up and down Mamaroneck Avenue. Well, there was a shout out, and as you're saying, Chief, right away, you have removed layers of fear. You've opened up communication. And I knew that you don't have to be best friends, but I knew if there was a case or an instance or an experience that I had, that I could reach out to him. And I think that speaks volumes of engaging the community. And I only hope that, and I know it's very, very difficult with the existing hiring practices and laws on the books in New York State to hire from your community, but I applaud you for your efforts.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And also something else I want to mention as part of, the reform, the police department was just awarded a grant for body-worn cameras. So we're hoping to implement that sometime this year. So I think that will give, maybe some people a little bit more comfort. Maybe it feels like it'll keep officers in check. Officers feel, keep interactions with the community, honest. So I think that's going to be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, the diversity, we're all striving for this level of diversity, to break down the barriers of bias and racism. I'll tell you a quick side. One of my daughters, who's in college upstate New York, and she had to take a diversity class. And she's going to college for early education. Well, majority of her fellow students are education majors, but also students majoring in criminal justice. And their goal is to go on and become police officers, policewomen, policemen on the state level, on the municipal level. Well, she was astonished as to the amount of resentment and pushback of students being required to take a class in diversity. And I think this speaks, what we're talking about is that if you can hire from within, if you can hire from your community, well, you've been able to, eliminate one of those obstacles that we're seeing, right, that she's seeing, that this resistance to diversity. Why do I need diversity? I'm from upstate New York, and everyone up there is predominantly white, so there's no need for me. Well, you are the person that should be taking that class, because if you do become a state trooper, well, you know what? You could be down here patrolling 95 corridor, and you're going to pull me over. And you've never encountered a conversation, or you've never had a conversation with a person of color. So I can't stress enough, I think, how important it is to hire from within and to break down those barriers so people of color see the police force as one of guardians and not warriors.
Agreed.
Yeah, that sounds good. And, I'm coming from the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. So I'm gonna, it's really my sort of, and my organization's desire to really keep peeling this onion and to not be afraid to talk about it. And, I've had more people of color than not be in conversations around police and ask that question of like, where do police get to say they made mistakes? Where do they get to say, you know what, I do have bias? Where do they get to say, I grew up, in a racist family and then I became a cop and here I am? Like, there has to be space for that. The amount of trauma that their job comes with, that people of color's lives come with, that white folks are trying to process, in this construct. And I don't mean to get like, hippy dippy or whatever, but I just think we have to keep talking about this in a compassionate way and in a way where we're trying to uplift each other and to truly connect and to say, it's been rough, but we can make change, like real substantial change. And, Jeff, you're not the spokesperson for all folks of color. Chief DeRuza, you're not the spokesperson for all cops, and, Bertha yourself. But I think these conversations are really important, and to have our community members be able to tap in and say, I'm watching this, no one's screaming, we all look reasonable, we all seem like we care. I think it's really healing. And again, it's a seed, and I hope it continues. So it's 7:46 and we have about a little over 30 people watching. Thank you for being here. If there are questions, you can raise your hand. There's a little hand raised symbol at the bottom of your Zoom, or I'm not sure actually if you're on YouTube or how that works, but send us a question and we will answer it. I will try to answer it the best we can. Anybody out there? I don't see any questions in the chat. Okay. We have a great job. Thank you. So I don't know if there are other things we want to tap into here tonight, or what does the next, conversation look like? What are some of the things that maybe, oh, wait, I think I might have a question. Hold on. I don't know if I'm maybe not looking at the questions correctly. Oh, here we go. From Danny, can the chief go over the question regarding how to respond to cops when being pulled over or stopped?
Yep. So again, we're going to have a document on the website be released next week that basically just talks about, the interaction with, because the same way that someone gets nervous when they get pulled over by the police officer is just as nervous because they don't know who they're encountering. So there is that fear almost going both ways. So to make the motorists and the police officer feel more at ease, it gives some tips about, what to do about, don't make, movements around, the vehicle, wait until the officer comes up to the car. And then when the officer asks for your driver's license, then to reach over and grab it. Just because, like I said, the officer is just nervous as the person is, and vice versa. So that's important to understand. And we expect that the officer does explain to the person, why he or she is being stopped. And, it starts the conversation from there.
Great. I'm sorry, I raised my hand by accident. Cora has a question. And I have to figure out how to do this.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I'm Cora, and my question is, has anyone taken an Undoing Racism workshop?
Or are you asking our panelists?
Well, okay, I was trying to define it, but has anyone on the panel, or is there any talk of that within, the town of Mamaroneck and the government level? on the city level, town level? Has anyone taken an undoing racism workshop? That's my question.
Cora, are you specifically talking about the PISAB training, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond? Yeah. Okay,
yes,
yeah. I'm familiar with that workshop. I don't know if any of you on the panel are. It's like a 3-day process.
Now it's about a day and a half or something.
Okay. Okay, so it's a process that's, correct me if I'm wrong, Cora, that's facilitated by a group of mixed race facilitators, and it really talks about the institutional and historical pieces of racism, and kind of takes us through like where we are now. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my question. And what's undergirding that question for me is the belief or understanding that it's not just the police, it's within all of our systems. And my thought is that that's a basic piece that should be on the table. And it's not that we stop there, but to have that understanding. It's not just the police, it's not just social worker, but every single system in our, let's leave it in our country. We won't go to the other countries, but in our, and I think if people have that understanding, they'll see more the need to have these difficult conversations, because we all learn from it and profit by it. So
thank you for that. I don't know if either are any of you familiar with that training. I know I took it, and that was actually one of the impetuses for me to start CURE. But
what is it's People's Institute for Survival and Beyond.
Yeah,
and they do undoing racism workshops.
Yeah, it was
pretty much as Nicole described it just now.
Yeah, so that sounds great. So I am definitely going to look into that. But what I can tell you is, as part of the training that the officers, the 2 modules so far and the 3rd one, it does talk about the history of policing. It goes into people that have been marginalized. So it does focus on that to give officers a perspective of other people's point of views. And when you encounter somebody, why they might react the way that they do. So they do get some of that as part of that training.
Okay, start. Good.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cora, for bringing that up. We have a question from Americas. Where can police find a safe place to express their trauma within repercussions, or maybe without repercussions? Sure.
So within the police department, we offer several avenues for them to seek counseling, anonymous counseling, things like that. And what we do make a point of is, if there is an incident that is what we consider traumatizing, what we will do is we will have counselors come on site, and we won't mandate that officers attend, but it usually is well attended. So officers talking to each other, talking to officers, and counselors that have training in speaking with officers is the best atmosphere for them to be able to discuss their feelings and emotions. So whenever something like that happens, we do give them an outlet to get them help and services.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if we have any more questions. Could a link? I think, let's see. Mayuki, thank you so much for having this conversation. What can community members, especially the youth, do to become a part of the conversation in improving relations between people of color and the police force? That's a great question. That's from Mayuki. Jeff, you have an idea on that in terms of having grown up here? And if you think of yourself, what would you have liked at that point, maybe in your teens, in high school, had you been able to have a dialogue with police? Is there something you think and police can do together?
Well, I think that, and that's a very good question, that Nicole, organizations such as CURE, I think that's certainly an avenue or for students, people, young people, to seek out and seek advice, and to broaden their knowledge. I think that I know that in Mamaroneck High School there is a diversity club, and they're addressing there's certain racism, as they see it. I think that you're going to continue to see evolve over the next year, 18 months, more a coherent push by maybe the villages and the town of Mamaroneck to reach out to the young, to the youth, be it through perhaps realm of trying to establish, a monument signifying and acknowledging the slaves who lived and worked here in our community. So I think that involvement I think youth involvement on that project can be worthwhile. And I've been myself speaking with Joe Liberti of Mamaroneck High School and how to involve students going forward. Looking at taking a template from the Equal Justice Initiative from Brian Stevens. He has a fantastic calendar, and that calendar depicts an injustice every single day in this country. And so I think I think there are a lot of different avenues which are just being discussed right now. So I want to say, just give it some time, perhaps 6 months or 8 months, that you'll see more of an organized effort to reach out, to the young people in our community.
And also speaking to that, we have right now 4 officers that became certified as community resource officers. So they're going to, just like Jerry said, start hosting different events to try to engage in the community and the youth in the community. And something else that we encourage, myself as well as the command staff, when officers are driving around, it's okay to stop and get out of your car and play some basketball with a couple of kids that you see them, or if they're riding their bikes, stop and talk to them and say, hey, what's going on? Can I help you? Or things like that. So we want them to be engaging, because it's those little interactions that a youth will remember and saying, oh yeah, if something happens later on, they need help, they can maybe trust that officer because he or she, met with him or her on the street and they already made that little bond. Even though it was just some minuscule amount of time, it does make a difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this has been a wonderful conversation. I really want to thank you all for being here. I feel like it's the beginning. I feel like it's connecting us in a better way. And I think we still have, 30 people hanging in there. So I appreciate everyone who came out tonight. For the Lines Between Us series, you can connect LMC, you can connect to LMC Media, the Community Resource Center, or CURE if you want to share stories. You saw the video, and the rest of them are on YouTube. They're really beautiful and they're anonymous, and it's a great way. And it's not just about law enforcement. There's racism in schools, there's racism in parks, there's racism everywhere, sadly. But we're gonna continue to forge on. And I thank you, Chief DeRuza, for being here. I know these are tough questions, and Jeff for sharing your stories, and Bertha for giving us an insight into the communities that you support. And I'm just very grateful to be able to have this conversation. Everyone stay well, and thank you so much. We'll be sending out resources, so we'll drop all the things that were mentioned here so the community can better inform themselves about the work that we're doing. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.